Good evening. On behalf of the members and friends of Countryside Community United Church of Christ, I want to extend a welcome to you all tonight, and thank you for coming. We've been looking forward to Frank rejoining us tonight. This is your third time to Countryside Community Church, and it always amazes me to just look at you and realize you've come back, and we're still friends, and all this. Some of you, I know the story. Frank and I won't repeat it other than to say that in the mid-'90s, if there was any person I hated most in the world, it was this person we've invited back 3 times. And in 2011, when I was invited to speak at the Wild Goose Festival in Shakori Hills, North Carolina, I almost pulled out because I saw his name on the program. So I called up a friend of mine saying, "What's Frank Schaeffer doing on the program?" She said, "Oh, Frank's changed. Frank's really changed." And I got to know him and realized Frank has really changed from when I was aware of him in the 90s, but also realized through getting to know him that I had changed as well. Anyway, just a very deep pleasure to have back somebody who I count as one of my best personal friends, and a person of wisdom, of intelligence, of great humor as well, to join us tonight. Before we begin, and I'm not supposed to be providing introductions, so I'm just saying how good it is to see you. Before we begin, for those of you who are new to Countryside, I want to especially welcome you and thank you for coming, and invite all of you to join us for some refreshments out in the foyer afterwards. And if you need to use the restrooms, if you're looking for those, they're all the way down to the left and against the wall to the left. If you happen to have a cell phone in your pocket or your purse, if you wouldn't mind turning that off or to vibrate or stun or wherever it needs to go so it won't ring, that would be very much appreciated. Now I would like to welcome our Center for Faith Studies Director, Kelly Keller, forward, and she will provide the actual introduction.
You did a great job. I am delighted to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. As a return guest, many of you are familiar with Frank, but maybe some of you are not. And I know that KIOS will be rebroadcasting this at some point. And so for that listening audience, I feel the need to say a little bit about why maybe Eric hated him in the 90s. Frank is the son of Francis Schaeffer, a man who many on the religious right and Christian fundamentalists would credit with making a certain brand of Christian religion a powerful force in American politics that still reverberates today, and reverberated very much on Tuesday, and just read Frank's blog. Frank describes himself as a survivor of both polio and an evangelical fundamentalist childhood. He is, in his own right, an acclaimed writer and a New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen books. He is a self-taught movie director as well as an artist. Beautiful painting I saw in Eric's house. Frank is a blogger on Huffington Post and Pathos. He was one of the first HuffPost bloggers and has a significant online platform worldwide. He's been a frequent guest on The Rachel Maddow Show, has appeared on Oprah, been interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air, and appeared on The Today Show, BBC News, and many other media outlets. I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag. This morning he said, "Oh, I was being interviewed by Al Jazeera. Sorry I was late." Oh, okay. He's a much sought-after speaker and has lectured at a wide range of venues, from Harvard's Kennedy School to Hammer Museum, UCLA, Princeton University, the list goes on. Pulitzer Prize winner and novelist Jane Smiley, writing in the Washington Post, says this of Frank: "Schaeffer's memoirs have a way of winning a reader's friendship. Schaeffer is a good memoirist, smart, and often laugh-out-loud funny. Frank seems to have been born irreverent, but his memoirs have a serious purpose, and that is to expose the insanity and the corruption of what has become a powerful and frightening force in American politics. Frank has been straightforward and entertaining in his campaign to right the wrongs he regrets committing in the 70s and 80s. And as someone who has made redemption his work, he has, in fact, shown amazing grace. I haven't known Frank as long as many of the people in this audience have, and I just got the opportunity to meet him, driving him from the airport to the hotel and yesterday, and grace is definitely the word that describes him. With us tonight to talk about his latest book, Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God, How to Give Love, Create Beauty, and Find Peace, Frank graces us again with his stories, which give us permission to be a little less certain, a lot more open, and perhaps a smidge more aware of the ever-surprising ways God might meet us on this road. Help me to welcome Frank.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Kelly, you should drive me to all venues and introduce me everywhere. That's lovely. Carve all that on my tomb, okay? It's a long one, but it's good. Thank you all for having me back again. This is a lovely thing for me. I'm on a book tour with this book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And most of the places I go are new to me, new venues, new people. This is sort of a homecoming for me. Eric and I are close friends. I have other friends in this community, and it's wonderful to be back here. This morning I had a wonderful interlude in my work in going to the art museum here, which is just stunningly gorgeous. It's a fantastic thing. I hope you're not like me. I live in the Boston area, and people come and see things where I live, and then I say, well, no, I haven't actually been there for the last 10 years because I live here. But what an amazing collection and how beautifully exhibited, and the building is just fantastic. So I spent a lovely morning there. Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about this book, and I'm going to begin by reading a short excerpt out of it just to set the framework for what I want to talk about. And this is a little bit out of context, but I think it's self-explanatory. I'd simply introduce it by saying this. I wrote a memoir called Crazy for God that actually I was back here talking about a few years ago. And out of that memoir came a correspondence that intrigued me because I talked about my journey from being raised in this evangelical background in Switzerland in a mission called Le Brie Fellowship, where I grew up. I was born in 1952. And so I lived through the transition of my own parents, going from being obscure evangelical fundamentalist missionaries with a kind of a Calvinist background to becoming much better known in the evangelical community. And then finally, in my late teen years, rather famous in the American evangelical context. And so I kind of lived in two childhoods. One, a pastor's kid in a small mission, unknown to other people. And then a second childhood that culminated with being the son of a famous evangelical leader and really getting an inside look at the belly of the beast, as it were, of big-time American religion. And going with my dad on speaking trips, and gradually at one point becoming his sort of nepotistic sidekick. And I sometimes like to say that only the mafia, the British royal family, and American evangelicals rope the next generation into the family business, as it were, in the way that I became Dad's sidekick simply because of a last name. And it's not just us, Franklin Graham, Billy Graham, Pat Robertson's family, and so forth and so on. My own journey took me out of that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I wrote this book called Crazy for God that traced this childhood, my sidekick stint, why I got out, my life afterward, and so forth. And that was the book that Jane Smiley reviewed for the Washington Post that you heard the little quote from there in the introduction. And I began to get emails and correspondence off of that book that intrigued me because they came from such diverse backgrounds, but they had a similar theme. I don't know, those of you who know the late author Christopher Hitchens, who was one of the new atheist authors, who wrote books such as God Is Not Great, and really, along with Dawkins and some others, became the father of the new atheist movement, was writing emails to me while reading the book, telling me how much he liked the book and how interested in it he was. And then I got an email from him, or I think it was actually a phone call, when he finished the book, saying to me, well, I'm very disappointed because I expected at the end of this book a clear declaration that you were an atheist and have joined our movement. And it was interesting because I was getting similar emails from some of my old evangelical friends who were telling me, we got to the end of the book and we're very disappointed because we thought after this long journey you would have a ringing affirmation of faith at the end and tell us that you were still a Bible-believing Christian and you had somehow returned to the faith of your family. And I thought, well, it's interesting because if you would change a word or two from these two camps, they were both disturbed by the same thing. And that is that they did not like the idea of ambivalence and paradox. And I began to coin in my mind a phrase which I forget when I really thought of this, but it just sort of sneaked into my brain a little bit. I began to think of people who were disturbed on this level from whatever background as certainty addicts. They had actually sort of trained the neural pathways of their brains to want answers where perhaps there are none. And that thought stuck, and I eventually got sick of writing the same email back to all kinds of people. And so this book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, came out of it. And so it grew out of this experience of trying to explain that one of the things that has happened in my own journey, going from this fundamentalist Christian background to someone of a very different politics and a very different view of faith, was that I had, as it were, maybe not healed myself. I don't think that is really what happened, but that I had changed my mind in a way that actually changed the way I began to think about things, and that is that uncertainty no longer was a bad thing to me that had to be answered, but maybe just the way things were. And I began to think of religion and these philosophical issues and questions in a very different way, and that is, instead of seeing them as a special category where you had to demand an answer, see them more like a relationship with a human being. I happen to have been married for the last 44 years to Jeannie, who I got pregnant when we were 17 and 18 in a fundamentalist mission. That was interesting. And had great and loving support from those folks, by the way. They were terrific about it. And Jeannie and I eventually got married, and we have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, 3 of whom live across the street from me, Lucy, Jack, and Nora. And Jeannie and I split our time between this sort of thing, and my writing and her work in the publishing field, to doing hands-on childcare 5 days a week for these little kids, which is actually what I like to do best. And the rest of what I do kind of supports that. But back in the day, Jeannie and I were in this fundamentalist mission as this young couple, and I was kind of the sidekick to my father, and we were working away. And that trajectory from that time till now brought me to this place where I began to see our relationship with eternal things, or God, or mystery, or wherever you want to sum it up in terms of spirituality, much more the way I see a human relationship. So because I've done some work in Hollywood, and in the temper of the times, a lot of marriages break up and so forth, I'll occasionally have someone who will say to me something like, well, how have you stayed married 44 years? Now, if they're smart, what they mean is, I've gotten to know you well enough to wonder why Jeannie has stuck with you. But that would only be somebody like Eric, who actually knows me a little better. But in most cases, they're looking for a kind of a technical fix. It's the evangelical born-again paradigm. In other words, how should I be saved? Okay, read this Bible verse, believe in Jesus, say this prayer, you're all set. They want to know, the seminar to go to, or the book to read, or the 7 things you must always do, or how to have good sex, or whatever it is. But of course, for someone who has been in a relationship for a while with a partner or a wife or children, you understand, just like any wise parent does, that there's no quick fix for education. You'd think that when you're a young parent until you realize every single one of your children is different. And so what's good for one and worked is not going to work for another one. They're going to have different interests, and lo and behold, they have their own personalities. They're not all carbon copies of you, and they don't like the same things. Well, similarly in relationships, there's not this kind of born-again moment where, okay, now I've got it all straight, I can make all this work. It really boils down to incremental steps. So being slightly facetious, but really this is closer to a good answer than here's the seminar you go to and the study guide. An answer on staying married for a while is, well, I bring my wife a cup of coffee in bed in the morning. That's one reason we've stayed married for 44 years. When I see the kitchen's a mess and I come in, I do some cleaning up because I'm trying to give my partner and my best friend a better day. That's one way you stay married. When we have sex, I work at making sure she has real pleasure instead of the teen fumbling around, where you promise, well, I'll pull out, and she shouldn't have believed me, and she got pregnant. I've learned between now and then. That's how you stay married 44 years. So really, when you come to these big issues of is there a God and what should we believe in and so forth and so on, I fault the new atheist movement and my evangelical background on exactly the same grounds. And that is they present these things as if there is an answer. And of course, there is not an answer to how to have a good relationship because every couple's different. Just like there's not an answer about how to educate a child because every child is different. Well, there is not a simple born-again paradigm of salvation in this life or the next because we are all individuals. We come at these things differently. And so for me, paradox is no longer a threat. Ambivalence or uncertainty is no longer something to be worked through till you get back to the safe ground of certainty. It's actually the way things are. People who run into trouble with relationships are people who are sure, here's the rule. Like my Calvinist background. I'm a man, so I'm in charge of the house, so I can be strict with the children and boss my wife around. That'll make things work just great. That's the rule. That's what's in the Bible. That's what's in our theology. And she's got to learn to stick with this, and that's how we'll make it work. Well, similarly, when you get to the new atheist movement, they have this kind of fundamentalist commitment to there not being a God, and the spiritual side of life can be explained away in the way that, say, E.O. Wilson does, as just simply a neurological function of illusion. And on the other side, you have Christians who have this kind of literalist view of the Bible, and they've got their theological rules. And of course, my point of view is a little different. And that is that we are, and I blink away from being single-celled creatures floating around in the mud. We are half-evolved, primitive primates. That's who we are today. On a journey that is by no means complete, we just barely got up on our hind legs to do anything, make a few handprints on a cave wall, build a couple nuclear weapons now and again, do one or two other things. And here we are standing looking at the cosmos and making vast cosmological statements and judgments about the cosmos and everything in it. Well, this is like the person who thinks they can read a marriage manual or go to a seminar and come away with the answer on how to have a human relationship, and they forget that it really boils down to bringing your wife a cup of coffee in the morning and a few things like that. So I look at ambivalence and paradox not as a kind of a second best, if we could only find the answer. I look at it as simply a true statement of the human condition. We don't know anything. We hope things, we believe things, we do things, we experiment, we grow. If you're closer to my age, which is 62, than say where I was when I was 17 and got Jeannie pregnant, you know more of what you don't know now. And that's how real life works. You see a trajectory in relationships. With my daughter Jessica, who's always the same age as our marriage. That's one advantage of getting your girlfriend pregnant. You can remember at least one kid's age. She's the only one I can ever remember how old she is. It's like, I remember. But I was harsh and unmitigatingly strict with her because I came from this background. Plus, I was a teenage kid and a jerk and tough anyway. And then you see the trajectory to where I have a relationship with my grandchildren today, and I'm a completely different person. If that's the journey one person takes in this tiny little, spit on a griddle moment we call a human life, we're in no position to then stand up and say, and now here are the answers to the cosmos and everything in it. That's just simply absurd. The best we can do is turn into better fathers and grandfathers, better husbands, better lovers, better wives, better partners, better friends. That's already huge if we can make that trajectory the content of a character. So, for me, when I wrote this book, I basically tell the story in this book of my time with my grandchildren and my wife and my family as a window into some larger issues. In fact, those are the larger issues. I'd put it the other way around. Those are the larger issues, but you can derive a little bit of information from other things. But one of the places where I try to do a little bit of a summing up toward the beginning of the book, which I think goes through what I've been just talking about, rattling on here about for a minute, is this. My kaleidoscopic beliefs are fickle and motivated by desire, wishful thinking, and wanting to fit in with my family and community and to make my marriage work. My dogmatic declarations of faith once provided status, ego-stroking power over others, and a much better income than I've ever earned since fleeing the evangelical machine. Certainty made things simple, gave me an answer to every question, and paid the bills. With the acceptance of paradox came a new and blessed uncertainty that began to heal the mental illness called certainty. The kind of certainty that told me that my job was to be head of the home and to order around my wife and children because the Bible says so. Embracing paradox helped me discover that religion is a neurological disorder for which faith is the only cure. These days, I hold two ideas about God simultaneously. He, she, or it exists, and he, she, or it doesn't exist. I don't seesaw between these opposites. I embrace them. I don't view this embrace as requiring a choice between mere emotion and fact, or between evolutionary biology and spirituality. Reality can't be so neatly parsed. Neuroscientists who analyze our chemistry-based brains still fall in love. Preachers declaiming a literal view of the Bible and so-called young earth still use petroleum products found because geologists operate on the premise that the earth is 4.54 billion years old. I don't view my embrace of opposites as a kind of agnosticism. I view it as a way things actually are. An agnostic neither believes nor disbelieves in God. I am not that person. I believe and don't believe at the same time. Maybe we need a new category other than theism, atheism, or agnosticism that takes paradox and unknowing into account. I believe that life evolved by natural selection. I believe that evolutionary psychology explains away altruism and debunks love, and that brain chemistry undermines my illusion of free will and personhood. I also believe that the spiritual reality hovering over, in, and through me calls me to love, trust, and hear the voice of my Creator. It seems to me that there is an offstage and an onstage quality to my existence. I live on stage, but I sense another crew working off stage. Sometimes I hear their voices singing in a way that's as eerily beautiful as the offstage chorus in an opera. So to me, those are the two parallel existences that I live in. And I'm not writing a book on a theory of what I think you ought to believe. I'm simply describing how I actually see things honestly myself. And again, I would draw a parallel with ordinary human relationships. Now that's a drink of water, a huge purple cup. So what I'm trying to talk about in this book here is not an appeal to people to believe in a certain way or to join my club or to see things my way. I'm trying to describe how at this part of my own journey out of this evangelical fundamentalist background, I've come to a place where I look at these spiritual qualities and the questions that confront us in an ordinary way, if I can put it that way, in the same way that we look at relationships. So for instance, if someone says, well, we can't discuss or we can't describe what the word God means, I would agree. But I would also say the same thing applies to words that we use all the time that actually give us the underpinnings of our entire existence. For instance, the word love. How would you define what love means? Sometimes in my family, love means that after Jeannie has walked out or I've walked out and the door slams and you hear the squealing of tires on the driveway, and one or the other of us is gone for good this time, love is that even though we both hate each other in that instant, There's enough of a history there, so we think things through and somebody comes back, and then I apologize, irrespective of what else has happened. So now, is that love? Well, it sure doesn't feel very nice. And at other moments, love is golden. Love is going to preschool before Lucy went into first grade and picking her up and crashing to my knees to meet this little girl running into my arms. And suddenly realizing that the young mothers who were meeting their children and me might be separated by 40 years of space and gender, but I had a better visceral understanding of who they were at that moment, because guess what? If anything happened to that little boy and girl running into any of those open arms at the end of preschool, our worlds would end. And at that moment, my heart and the heart of that young mother, whose name I might even not know, beat on exactly the same wavelength, and gender, belief, religion fades away. What you are seeing there is the reality of love. I know exactly who she is, and she knows who I am. We are human beings feeling this essential ingredient. And so one of the things that I think has come to me over the years is that we've asked the wrong questions often about our lives and other people. And I'll give you an example of this. I think that we put a moralistic overlay on the way we judge things. Is it right? Is it wrong? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Thinking of the young mother at eye level with her toddler and me on the same page, I think there's a much better way to look at these issues. And this has a big impact on our kind of judgmental, harsh religion in the age we live in. And that is to ask a very different question. Not, is it right? Or even, is it true in the sense we usually mean that word, whatever that word means, speaking of inscrutable words. But, is it beautiful? And I think when we begin bring an aesthetic sensitivity to questions of spirituality, we get a lot further than we do if we bring questions of right and wrong, agree, disagree, whether we think the theology is correct or incorrect. Because our connection with other human beings and with the world around us actually is much more solid when you get into the area of aesthetics than it is morals. Morals gets into the area of motivation, sincerity, knowledge, all this business. Very tough to ever judge something on that basis, and our ideas of what is right and wrong change. But I think when I look at the quality of relationships between two partners, or a man or a woman, or two men or two women, whatever the configuration may be, gay, straight, doesn't matter, it's always the same picture, or with children, or with education, or with the kind of world we live in. A much better paradigm is the aesthetic one. Is it beautiful? Which is strange because it sounds much more subjective, but actually it's a lot more objective than a moral overlay. And I think another thing is that when we get into these areas of what we believe, and something I talk about in the book, we're much too high and mighty about this stuff. Someone will say to me something like, well, why do you still go to church? Because I go to a Greek Orthodox church. I like Byzantine liturgy. And I draw a comparison in my book to the movie The Great Lebowski, so you can just read it and figure that out. We all have our rituals. He bowls, I go to church. Bowling's a liturgy too, you know. It's just whatever you do repeatedly with your friends, even though you know them well enough, so you should find new friends, which is most of our churches we go to. But anyway, the point being that when you have someone come to you and say, well, if you believe thus and so, how can you still do this? How can you have these doubts? How can you say the Nicene Creed in a Greek Orthodox church if you have this uncertainty principle in your life, or you've embraced paradox? Well, I can say it with complete sincerity. The only thing is I don't know what it all means. And the difference between me now and then is that I used to pretend I knew what these things meant. I remember meeting an old monk on Mount Athos about 25 years ago when I brought my very evangelical views to my first interest in orthodoxy and went for a little retreat there in Greece to this wonderful monastery called Simonos Petra that was formed in the 10th century and been there ever since. And I was typical evangelical background. I said to him, well, you give communion to children and they don't even know what it means. Because for me, everything had to be theological, correct belief. They don't even know what communion is, a newborn child. Why would you do this? Give them the sacraments. They don't even know what it is. And he thought about it for a minute, and he looked at me and said, do you? No. So mystery is not such a bad thing. And so actually, in a way, if you wipe mystery out of faith and replace it with theology, which is just a form of irrationalism, really, you have actually obliterated faith. And so when we say when I say in the book, religion is a neurological disorder and faith is the only cure, that's a little bit of what I'm getting at. So when people say, well, why do you still go to church? Instead of coming up with some highfalutin reason, oh, well, here are the 7 things, and I believe this, and read this book by so-and-so. These days I try to tell the truth. Well, that's how my mother raised me. So I feel comfortable on Sunday doing this. You got a problem with that? Now that's an honest answer, but it's not the one people want. Why do you believe something? Well, because my mom told me so. But wait a minute. Do we actually have any better answers than that when we think about why we think something? I was raised in a certain way. If someone says, well, then is that your sincere belief or is that just something your parents pounded into you? Questions like that used to bother me. Now I say, you know what? I'm never going to figure this out. I don't know where I begin, where nurture and nature end. I don't know what is hormonal. I don't know what is primate-driven, evolutionary, ancestral village power talking in my life. I don't know what my sincere beliefs are that I've come to, because to be really honest, let's cut the crap for a minute. About everything we believe, let's be honest for 1 second. If this is the one thing we do tonight that's honest, this is honest. Let's all admit something. What we believe, who we are, what we like, what we dislike, is not a matter of choice that we were given all these options and now we have come to this sort of mountaintop of knowledge and we've made this choice. It's not so much a choice when it comes to belief, it's circumstances. If Eric Elness and I had both been born in 15th century Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, do you think I'd be standing here talking tonight about my evangelical background and this view of God, like somehow I would have come to these conclusions? Of course it's to do with who you are, where you live, what century you're born in, what culture you're part of. So let's not have all this nonsense about objective truth, that you've come to this as if you're on some mountaintop with a bunch of philosopher kings talking about it for 60 years and you've drawn a rational conclusion. There's not a rational person in this building. Sorry, the door's there. I know how to get out of it if you now charge. But really, we're not. We are a mixture of things that if you spend your whole life trying to figure it out, you will go mad. That madness is called fundamentalism because you want to become a certainty addict. And there are atheist fundamentalists, and there are evangelical fundamentalists, and there are Islamic fundamentalists, there are Hindu fundamentalists who are running around India in the Nationalist Party now trying to make it a truly Hindu culture, in the same way that we have candidates who were recently elected in the last election who want this to return to a Christian culture, and so forth and so on. But, you know, if you step back for a minute, instead of trying to make this a public discussion where you've got to make everything fit, and are really honest, it's how you were raised, where you were raised, the century you're in, your natural interests. All these things work together. So instead of saying, ooh, I've got to sort all this out and decide what's really true, how about just actually accept the fact that you are who you are and deal with it on a level where you can grow as a human being in the area that really matters? And what is that area? Another shift in my life would have been to say, well, I've got to measure my life up to this verse or chapter in a book, the Bible, say, or some other book of knowledge. But for me, it would have been the Bible. But in terms of where I am on the path of my own journey now, as a spiritual being who inhabits this biological machine, but looks out at the world with these spiritual eyes, who lives on stage as a secularist, but off stage hears these voices, as it were, that person has come to a conclusion there's an actually much more accurate mirror that reflects something actually true for once, that isn't subjective. And it's not in a book. It's what you read in the eyes of the people who know you best, where there's no bullshit and you can't get away with anything. It isn't in a book. Who I am as a father is not a theological concept of fatherhood. Who I am as a grandfather is not a theological or philosophical concept. And I'll give you an illustration. A little while ago, a couple years ago when Lucy was about 3.5, she put a napkin over a candle on our screen porch, And I arrived just in time to see this nice blue sheet of flame going up toward the ceiling. And I took the napkin, and no harm was done, and dropped it into the sink and put some water on it, and everything was fine. And I went back in there, and Lucy said, oh, she was very wide-eyed about this. And I said to her, oh, that wasn't a terribly good idea. You have to be careful of candles and don't put things, oh, I'll never do that again, Ba. She calls me Ba. And later I had a thought. I was thinking, 40 years ago with my daughter Jessica, who, by the way, has wound up as my best friend, literally, and we Skype 3 times a week. She lives in Brussels, so thank God for grace. But if that had been Jessica, I would have screamed at her, and I might have slapped her, and I would have thrown it back in her teeth again, as this jerk young father saying, don't you ever do that again. And if she did something a week later that sort of reminded me of that carelessness, I'd grind it into her. See, you're doing the same thing. Didn't I tell you to be careful? And later I was thinking, with Lucy, all I said to her was, that's fine, don't worry about this. And a couple of weeks later, she broke a plate or something helping me unload the dishwasher. And the same thought struck me, and Lucy looked at me slightly worriedly, and I told her what was really on my mind and my heart then. And I said to her, now, Lucy, there is nothing in this house I care about as much as I care about you. I don't care about any of this stuff. All I really love in this house is you at this moment. Don't worry. I don't care if you break everything here. Now, that never would have been something I said to my own child, but to my grandchild, it came sincerely from my heart. That's the arc of change. So what is my reward? My reward is this. It is that, unlike with my own children, when they did something bad or made a mistake, what I read in the mirror of their eyes, which is so much more accurate than anything in a book, was fear. What I read in Lucy's eyes is unconditional trust and love. It's a completely different reflection. Now, that is the mirror that I look to for a check of how my life is going in terms of who I am to this child. And that's what I care about. Whether it measures up to a verse in the Bible that says, don't spare the rod and spoil the child, I don't care. Whether it matches up to a Calvinistic idea of what fatherhood is and dominating the females in your household, I don't care. Because once you see the reflection of unconditional trust and love in the eyes of a child, and you've seen fear in the eyes of other children that you treated very differently when you were a different person, then you understand the difference in your own life between where you want to be and what grace is and where you were coming from. And that, to me, is a far more trustworthy and real spiritual journey and measuring stick than anything in a book or a sermon or a text. And so with that in mind, there's another little thing that I want to read you here in the book, which gives you a flavor of this spiritual journey, and it has nothing to do with theology, and again, is personal and anecdotal. But I will tell you that if you're in a Greek Orthodox church, the liturgy takes place, and then you have communion served from a chalice. And so if we were all in an Orthodox church and I was the priest, I'd be standing here with a chalice, and I would feed you the communion with a spoon. And you would all line up here and take the communion, and the line would shuffle forward. It would take a bit of time, and you would be in that line. So with that preamble, I'll just read you this so you get a little bit of a flavor of what I'm talking about in terms of seeing things a bit differently than I would have 25, 30, 40 years ago. I was shuffling forward in the communion line with Lucy in my arms. I was lost in gloomy thoughts, brooding on my past and on my doubts, my failures, and my meanness to Jeannie when I was young, stupid, and so woefully controlling. I was feeling that going to church was a waste of time. I was feeling unworthy in every sense of the word and sinking into a gray depression. Lucy and Jack are always in and out of my arms in church, as they have been since they were born. So I'd actually forgotten I was holding her. These days, I hardly know how to be in church without a grandchild riding on my hip. With my head bowed and my eyes closed, I shuffled forward to the chalice to receive the body and blood through a ritual I don't comprehend and that seemed entirely pointless that day. I was adrift in my melancholy. Then I felt the touch of Lucy's hand on my face and, startled, opened my eyes. It took me a moment to remember where I was. Lucy was gazing into my face. She wasn't smiling, just gazing at me in that straightforward way that only a child achieves, with serious concentration and offering me a transparent look that had no agenda. She wanted nothing from me. All I saw in Lucy's expression was unconditional trust. All I saw was a child who knows me now and who never expects anything but kindness from me. She did not know of my past sins, failings, and bitter self-accusing regrets. Lucy was not judging me. I was accusing myself, while she was just gently touching her Ba's cheek, checking to see why my eyes were closed. Lucy inclined her head and kissed me. This thought crashed into my brain. I am being seen as I'd like to be perceived, not as I see myself. I have seen the face of God. And to me, that's the kind of kernel, the treasure of a journey away from this idea that somehow correct theology will change you, to really the heart of where we all have our deepest longing, that I think Dante refers to in his Inferno when he gets to the doors of paradise, having gone through all Hades. He has to drink from two streams, and one stream that Dante drinks from, he forgets every bad deed and sorrow. And the other stream he drinks from, he remembers every happy moment and good thing he did. And then he is ready to enter paradise. And surely, if we were all honest with each other tonight, that is our idea of paradise, to see yourself. Because we are our accusers. God is never accusing anyone. If God loves us the way I love Lucy and Jack and Nora, God is not our problem. We are our problem. But to see yourself actually as you wish you could be seen is really, I think, what we're all after in this life. And whatever spiritual path we're on has no point to it whatsoever unless it gets you closer to being able to do that. And so I think Dante is totally wise, because surely that's what paradise is. Paradise is to have in the forefront of our thought and memory those things that we love and hold dearest about us and about what we've done in our relationships with other people, and is the forgetfulness of all those things for which we are deeply ashamed and have regret. And so I don't think that true spirituality comes from correct theology. I don't think it comes from a better philosophical idea or a new scientific discovery. I think it comes from reading in the eyes of the people who know us best what we wish we would see in our own eyes when we look in a mirror alone. And that is to see yourself as you wish you were. So to me, the spiritual journey is all about becoming that person, not to satisfy an angry God, but to satisfy our own anger against ourselves. And I think the source of that anger has nothing to do with theology or original sin. I think it has to do with our evolutionary process. We are weird creatures, in case you hadn't noticed. We are weird creatures. We are biological machines. All our thoughts are dictated to us by neural chemistry. And yet out of these eyes look spiritual creatures who see the world around them through these spiritual eyes, seeking meaning where our biology and the matter of the universe as it's built tells us there is none. So we're an anomaly. Now, to someone like E.O. Wilson and the other people in the New Atheist movement, they feel that somehow proves there is no God and there's no spiritual content to life. To me, it has the opposite effect, and that is to make me want to plunge deeper into the mystery of unknowing, because surely that's where we don't find an answer, but we find a question that says to us, yeah, there is more here than meets the eye. It's hard to put your finger on. It's like the word love. It's difficult to define. It's like the word beauty. But life is meaningless and hopeless without a sense of love and beauty. And so the fact that these terms can't be defined does not make them meaningless. We do not have all the answers, and that's for anybody who's an atheist or a Bible-believing Christian. It's nonsense. And so I guess people ask me about the title of this book, why I'm an atheist who believes in God. You know, why would I call a book something that's sort of contradictory like that? And and I'll finish up and then I'll take some questions, by the way, by saying that to me it's an anti-labeling title. Because you're not a label. You're not white or gay or Republican or Democrat. You're not black. You're not any of those labels. You are a complicated thing. And you're not even the same thing you were. I am not the jerk I was. I'm still a jerk. It's a different kind of a jerk. But I'm not the same jerk. I'm not the same jerk. People ask me sometimes, well, what would your father, Francis Schaeffer, think about whatever it is I'm saying? Like, say what I'm talking about tonight. I'd say, well, which guy are you talking about? The young fundamentalist minister who went to Europe calling the Roman Catholics the whore of Babylon in 1947. Sure, he was there to save them from hell because they didn't have fundamentalist Calvinist theology. Or the completely different person at the end of his life, or the kind of guru to hippies and beatniks in the 1950s and 60s running this evangelical hippie commune in the mountains who was giving lectures on Bob Dylan and having arts festivals. Which guy are you talking about? And the same goes for me. I have a passage in the book where I say, listen, if I wrote this book again in 10 years, I'm sure I'd put things differently. And guess what? If you read it again in 20 years, it will be a completely different book, and I will not have snuck into your house and changed the words around, but you will have changed. So whatever else we bring to the table, we have to bring an acknowledging of the fact that we are not fixed targets. We are a moving object. Life is a journey. And spirituality is no different. And that's why all fundamentalist ideas about spirituality are an utter crock, because they're built on, hey, this is it, here's the formula, you're done. That born-again paradigm, that before and after, doesn't apply to anything else in life. You know, young people sometimes say to me in writing programs in universities, how do I become a writer? And my question to them, and I'm not being a smartass, is always, well, did you write anything this morning? That's how you become a writer. There's not a quick fix here. You do it every day, you do it for 25 or 30 years, and then you'll write something good. How do you stay married for 44 years? You bring your wife a cup of coffee in bed. How do you become a better grandfather than a father? You get on your knees to your daughter one day when she's about 18, and you apologize, and you weep, and you hug her, and you say, I'm so sorry that I screwed up your childhood. Forgive me. And you go from a new place. And that's something that happened with Jessica and me. And then you back it up with words. You start behaving a bit differently, and it's incremental. There aren't any quick fixes. There's no born-again experience in any area of life. So why would we expect a quick fix theologically? Why would we think we're now going to have the answer? Read one more book by Richard Dawkins, and now I'm sure I'm an atheist. Good luck. Read one more book on the Bible, and now I'll believe it better. It's not how it goes. So why I'm an atheist who believes in God, the subtitle, How to Give Love, Create Beauty, and Find Peace, the how-to is to embrace the actual human condition and not start looking for somewhere we can't be. And where you can't be is in a safe zone of absolute certainty. And if that's where you think comfort is going to be, you will go crazy. Or you'll do what fundamentalists do and build the walls higher and higher and get crazier and crazier, as we just saw in the last election, without waxing too political, but let me do it for 1 minute. And that is, the people that won big because they reduced the election to an anti-Obama campaign, basically told the American people, hey, listen, vote for us, or you'll be pooping blood while they cut your head off. So we'll make the world very, very dangerous, and it's either ISIS and Ebola or us. And of course, that idea of fearing the world, and I'm being a little facetious, is really one that all fundamentalist religion builds into a defense mechanism that says, you not only have to embrace these certainties, but if you leave them alone, it's a big, cold, bad, dangerous world out there, and you need to make sure you cling on to this thing here. And that's our politics, that's our religion, that's where America is. And by the way, that applies to the left and the right, because the left does exactly the same thing with all their certainties. And so this kind of meanness that has crept into everybody from MSNBC to Fox News, and this idea of there's no quarter, no middle ground, no uncertainty, this certainty addiction cuts across the board. I'm very aware of it, having just written this book, because I get a whole slew of emails from people who are atheists who are complete literalists. They will literally write to me as if I can't read English and never read a dictionary and say, you cannot be an atheist who believes in God. It's like, hey man, titles are supposed to get you interested in the book. This book is about not being a literalist. See, that's what the point of the book is. But nuance and humor are something that don't exist in that playing field of radical atheism or radical Christianity. So, with that, let me wrap this talk up and ask if there's a couple questions. We'll get into some Q&A, and I'll repeat the question for people who can't hear it, and then we'll get to the actual business of the evening, which is you buying my book, which I will sell to you and sign over there because I'm on an author tour, and authors earn their living from selling books. Was I clear about that? In that area, by the way, I'm a fundamentalist and very certain what you ought to do. And I think your salvation depends on it. Okay. All right. And if you sleep with my book under your pillow, you will be healed. Okay, I won't go there. Okay. Forget that part, but thank you.
You reference religious ritual a little bit, and what's your current take on that? What I mean by ritual is, like communion,
Sure.
or baptism, or going to church, chants, things
Right.
like that.
Good question. All of which I do. The question is, how would I reference religious ritual? Listen, we are creatures of ritual. We need rituals. And we need rituals because, guess what? We are physical beings. We need a place to be physical. I have friends of mine who say, well, hey, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And I don't discount that. I think that's a perfectly good thing to do. Or I'm spiritual, I'm an atheist. Of course, I don't go to church. Actually, in my Greek Orthodox church, we have quite a number of atheists who come to church because they want to be in the community. And that's perfectly valid. That's one of those good, honest reasons that sometimes escapes us when we talk about, what you have to believe. But I think ritual is very important because people, for instance, who say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, so I don't go to church, my answer to them is then, where do you do community? And it's very much like someone who says, well, I love drama, but I never go to a play. Well, okay. Where do you see Shakespeare? My personal aesthetic taste, I'm not saying this is a question of right and wrong. I'm one of these people who likes my Shakespeare unfooled around with. I like things to be exactly as they are. I like tradition. I love ritual. I'm someone who doesn't want to go to new places all the time. I love going back to the same place. I've been in the same house for 34 years, married to Jeannie for 44 years, and I love ritual, especially if it's beautiful. So to me, a Byzantine liturgy is a wonderful thing. But I also think that if we don't have markers in our life, and whether it's trick-or-treating at Halloween, or the ritual of a child's birthday, or flowers on somebody's anniversary, okay, so let's invent a whole other new way of doing non-ritual life. And guess what? The first thing you would do is, after you've done it twice, it's a ritual. So it's like a child, anybody who has children. Any book they like once is one you're now going to read 50 times in a row. So deal with it. You better like this book. So be careful what you buy, because, if it's like they love the purple clown, you will be reading about this purple clown a lot. And because children have an innate, I kind of trust children's taste in these things. Children love ritual. Children love stability. Children love tell me again, tell me again. Tell me again. Do this again. Let's go to the same place on Plum Island and walk there, Bob, where we always go. Child finds great security in what we always do. And what's so cute, of course, is, they've done it 3 times and now it's what we always do. Because they don't have, but we're the same. Maybe it actually ties into something bigger. Maybe we live in an orderly universe that has an actual shape to it, because before the Big Bang, when everything was just energy according to astrophysics, and then it became matter, maybe what was there before was something that we call love. Maybe there's a pattern here. Maybe we seek these rituals to live out the fullness of who we are as human beings. There's a reason for community. So I love ritual, and I couldn't live my life without these markers. I would be terrified to live a life without ritual. I'm comforted by ritual. And so to me, ritual plays a huge part. I don't want to have to make up everything as I go along. You know, I was interested the other day. I was an inch away from becoming a rock god. I mean, like a rock and roll star, because I got to sit in the bus with the band Delta Spirit when they were playing at the Paradise in Boston, because somebody I knew the bass player, and we were talking. And so here's this guy. He's a rock star. Delta Spirit's a great band, by the way. And we were sitting and talking, and you would think, okay, you know, here's the rock guy, you know, rock god, and all these screaming fans, and they're all going to wave their cell phones around and stuff. But I said to him, oh, and when did you get into town this morning? Well, what did you do first? Well, I was looking for an Anglican church to go to because I like to go to Mass every day. And I said, oh, really? You know, what kind of... And he said, hey, listen, I'm in the rock and roll business. The last thing I want is, you know, to go to church where there's a guitar on the stage and we're inventing new things. I want the same old thing. So, and I was thinking, oh, okay, I found a guy I totally get, because that's the same way I look at ritual. So there's areas in life where you want the creative and the new, and then there's other areas where you want comfort, and so forth and so on. So to me, ritual is not some special thing reserved to religion. It's the same reason I like to go back to the same pizza joint, because I know Mary behind the counter, and I can tell the guy how I like the crust burn a little bit, and he knows exactly what I mean, because I've known him now for 15 years, and I can ask him how his kid is, and that's ritual. And I think we find great security there. So ritual's a big deal, but not just for religion. Yeah, another question.
Yes, we have a question from online.
Ian Lynch was listening to your conversation when you're talking about how you, your parents taught you things. And his question was, if it is what you were told to do, if it's just circumstances, in what way do you make it your own?
Yeah, by the way, just an explanation
beliefs?
to people who don't know the ritual in this community. This is going online, being streamed, and so there's questions coming in to Chris back there, who's asking for somebody else. Her voice isn't, you know.
I'm not Ian Lynch.
Yeah, that's right. You're not Ian.
I just play him on TV.
Yeah, so basically, how do you make up your mind what your own things are? Well, you know, precisely that's the point. I don't. If you want to find some peace in your life, you don't want to spend your whole life trying to dig and find out who you really are, because you will never find that out. There's never going to be this neat package of where your own views begin and what you've come to neutrally for yourself. I'm much more mundane when it comes to that. And that is, it's just like your question about ritual. It's what works for me. And the difference between me now and me then is I'm not trying to convert anybody here to do it my way. And so, you know, what you need in order to be happy is to have this kind of a marriage, these many grandchildren, go to this kind of church. This is not what I'm talking about. I use my own life as an example, just simply to say, well, this is my snapshot of reality. Now, what's yours? And where it's useful to think about these things is precisely the opposite. It's to free yourself from thinking that you've got to come up with these answers about what's me, what's my family, as if you have to have original thoughts about all this, and rather say, listen, within that framework, here's how I can make this work. And not do it on simply the selfish basis of what makes me happy, but flip it and look through the other side of the telescope and start looking into I don't want to be like a broken record, but start looking into the faces of the people who know you best. One of the reasons I got out of big-time evangelical work is I looked into the face of the person who knew me best, which was Jeannie. At that point, we had been together about 15 years, and I was driving her into the ground. So I had a real choice, you know, go do big-time evangelical work and continue to be this jerk who comes home angry off the road and totally stressed out, or get out of this. And so I don't think it's a question of how do I get the right idea, but how do I actually look at the content of my own character as it affects the people I know best around me, where there's no BS and no fooling and you know really where you stand. And if that becomes your standard, you come up with a life that, to me anyway, gives love and creates beauty, and that's where you find peace. But it's not by looking in, it's by looking out at the people who are around you, who know you best, and seeing the effect of what you do, who you are, how you live, is having on them. And if that starts being your measure, that to me is a much truer guide than a theological or intellectual construct. And that's just, you know, where I've come to that. Yeah, you had another question over there.
I'd like to offer you an affirmation That be all right?
Thank you. Yes.
I've heard you speak twice. For me, your life is a gift. But for me, that's not by accident. That's by grace. That's by God's grace. And for me, that's a certainty. That's not fundamentalist. That's not judgmental. That's just reason, just common sense. So I thank God for your life.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's a nice word. I'll give you $1 again. And a free copy. Hey, no free copies of the book. No refunds. Yeah.
This may be slightly out of context, whatever that may be. I wonder if you could speak for a moment about salvation.
Well, you could all hear the question, right? Because you have a microphone. Speak for a moment about salvation. Well, there's, like the word love and everything else, this word can have a lot of meanings. Again, I would say look first at the incremental, smaller parts before we talk about this huge idea. The first thing I would say, and this is a snapshot of where I'm at tonight. It's not like, oh, here's, the conclusion. Taking the theological spin for a minute, I do not believe that if someone like me in the arc of a short life can begin to look at the person of Jesus Christ as someone who was significant because they planted what I call in this book an empathy time bomb in history. That same empathy time bomb points to a creator who wants to burn most of his grandchildren like Lucy in hell for eternity because she called him the wrong name, said he had 8 arms, or screwed up one of the rules. It doesn't compute. And that's nothing to do with theology. That's to do with feeling the empathy that I sense in the teaching and the ministry of Jesus Christ within my own life as it works or does not work in terms of what you see in the faces of the people around you. So when we look at theological ideas which define salvation as a correct idea, as in belief in the Bible, I'll just throw a few thoughts out. One is that a lot of evangelicalism actually has nothing to do with following Jesus or even Christianity because it's actually a cult of a book. And it's self-described. People describe themselves, I am a Bible-believing Christian. Well, how about a Jesus-following Christian? That would be a very different construct. And if you actually look at how Jesus dealt with the book, which of course is just the Torah, which by the way wasn't a book then because it hadn't been bound together into a canon. That didn't happen until about the year 100 in terms of, okay, it's a book. But when he talks about the Torah, it's always in opposition. So basically, Jesus is in an argument with his book. He says things like, the law says, but here's what I say. So he's adding something. So people who want to follow Jesus have a choice. They can follow the book or they can follow Jesus. And the first thing that a follower of Jesus would do in looking at the rest of the book, it would seem to me, would be to use Jesus as the lens through which you read the book. And that includes the Old and the New Testament. Because if Jesus is the lens through which you read it, you immediately are in opposition to big pieces of this book, just as he was. Not just in word of the book may say, but here's what I'm telling you, but this overarching sense of an empathy time bomb that he lived out. So, and my point here is in the end, you get to a point where you're just saying, well, if Jesus is the lens through which you read the book, then obviously you're not being saved from an angry God, because Jesus is looking at what this book is, this sort of dual message running through the Old Testament of a Molech-type God-devil on one hand, and then this great merciful treat the stranger in your own land as you would treat yourself, this argument that runs through the Jewish scripture. When Jesus begins to interpret the book, not just through what he says, but what he does, it seems to me a huge roadblock goes up to the idea of salvation from God. And it becomes salvation from ourselves. Because Jesus is never about God hates you, and now I'll give you the trick to get away from this anger. It's always God loves you and wants you to worship in spirit and truth, like he told the Samaritan woman at the well. So look at the actual life of Jesus Christ. Forget all the New Testament passages about Jesus written by people who are trying to put together a church which are kind of split, where Paul one day is saying there's neither Jew nor Gentile nor male nor female, which follows exactly who Jesus was. And then another day he says, if you're a woman, sit down, shut up, cover your head, don't pray, don't sing. In fact, don't even come to church, you bother me. That part's not in there. But the rest is pretty close. So you have a decision. You say, well, what goes with the empathy time bomb and what's something else? Where's the organization man building a machine, and where's the guy who actually is trying to follow the teaching of Jesus? So when you look at Jesus, okay, just look at a couple of points that I talk about in the book a little bit. All right, so you've got a bleeding woman who, if she touches Jesus, now he's ritually unclean for a long time. And he doesn't say to her, get away from me, you're menstruating, and I hate women on top of this. He says, good, your faith is going to make you clean. Jesus goes to somebody's house. This is the Middle East, okay? So picture Al-Qaeda training camp here in terms of sensibility towards women. I'm being serious. The Middle East has been an unforgiving place for women for a long time, and big chunks of it. And Jewish society no different, even today, if you look at what happens in a lot of Orthodox Jewish communities. Jesus comes into a household and he tells the two women in the kitchen, get out of the kitchen, stop doing the women's work, come talk to me, an unattached single male in your house without a male relative present. Instead of doing housework, let's just talk. Holy crap. This is not the Middle East. This isn't even the 21st century Middle East. This hasn't happened anywhere yet. Let's just talk as equals. Paul's not going to do that. Woman at the well, a Samaritan comes to him and she knows the rules better than he does. She says, you shouldn't be talking to me. I'm enemy tribe, wrong faith, wrong religion. We worship on the wrong mountain. Have nothing to do with me. Jesus says, hey, actually none of this matters. I don't care what your religion is or what your tribe is, because a time is coming when it's spirit and truth, and this is actually what God wants. Now, you can go with that, or you can go with a literal fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible that tries to cram Jesus into the Bible and make it all fit. But I look at it very differently, and this is just me talking, and I'm not a theologian. I don't try to make Jesus fit the Bible anymore. I try to make the Bible fit Jesus. And you really can't do both. So I grew up where, in my family, in the more evangelical tradition, the reason that there were seminaries and Bible commentaries was essentially, if you really cut to the chase for a minute, is to try to make this all work as one whole cloth. I don't think it is a whole cloth. I think you have a real divine intervention into human history to plant an empathy time bomb that advances human ethical evolution about 10,000 years, and we're about 2,000 years into the process. That's just a personal view. And the rest of it is a footnote. Nothing else matters. So the way you kind of see this is, I guess, by asking a sort of a Jesus-like question. I'm not saying I'm asking a Jesus-like question, but he's always asking these questions. Who is the real neighbor? So I'll give you the modern prodigal son, the modern Good Samaritan. Tonight in Denmark, women are getting a year of paid maternity leave. Their husbands are getting 6 months of paid maternity leave. They have a national healthcare system that works. They have an educational system that is rated top in the world along with Finland. It doesn't matter how much money you have, you can go to college and not go into debt. And women have rights at work to fend off sexual advances and all kinds of harassment that they do not have in this culture. Okay? And it's also rated one of the happiest societies in the world on all these happiness charts. Now, tonight in Denmark, the average population is a church-going, quote, Christian population by evangelical standards is less than 2%. Okay? So now when you look at this Danish atheist bureaucrat administering a healthcare system where women can take a year of paid leave and have their jobs guaranteed when they come back, that there are no people living at a poverty level as we have in our country, and where their husbands can come home and be with their family, and this is built into the social fabric, and you have a southern politician living in somewhere like North Carolina who's stripping food stamps, making sure that they're going to roll back this terrible thing called Obamacare because, God damn it, Jesus doesn't want people to have health care unless they can work in the American system and pay for it. Now, who is the actual follower of Jesus? Is it the person who's saved and went down to that Billy Graham crusade 14 times and accepted Jesus? Or is it the person who is actually doing and building a world? And I'm saying Jesus was a Danish socialist, okay, so don't. But that's the kind of uncomfortable parable into our own period of history that we don't want to deal with because we put it on this abstract theological thing. So then where does salvation? Well, Jesus keeps saying salvation is to do the will of the Father. And then he explains again and again that the will of the Father is to worship in spirit and truth and to be the person who looks into the eyes of the person left by the side of the road. And unlike the evangelical leader who passes by, which is the equivalent of our day, the Islamic member of ISIS, because this is a hated person, stops. So we've lost the kind of anarchic spin of Jesus' parables because Samaritan, Schmaritan, what do we know? But let's put it in today's terms, because this is how radical it is when you read it in context, just like his telling Mary and Martha to come out of the kitchen is a radical feminism. Jesus says, there's this guy on the road who's been mugged in a bad area of your city. And a local Lutheran bishop and a Roman Catholic priest walk by, and they go by on the other side of the road, and an evangelical national leader comes by in his limo, and he goes the other side of the road. But there's this kid who's been debating whether he's going to join ISIS, a radicalized Muslim who is 19 years old, and he wants to go off to a training camp in Syria and fight for the Islamic revolution. He stops. That's how radical it is. These are hated and feared people. Now, who is his neighbor? Seen in that context, this kind of following Jesus as a theological construct, salvation isn't so much about did I believe right? It's who are you? Are you the guy who stops or not? What is your culture? How are women treated? How are children treated? Jesus is very practical. So the theological spin is really a nice backdoor to stop us from being accountable to what really matters. That's how I see it. So I think Jesus is about salvation. But I think it's not a salvation from hell. I don't believe there is a hell. There's a good movie, Hellbound, by the way. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. I happen to like it because they interviewed me. But what I do believe is that we can build many, many hells on this earth by not following Jesus. So Jesus brings salvation, okay? He brings us salvation from ourselves and our own worst semi-evolved primate instincts that are about 10,000 years away from where he was trying to take us. And so to me, if Jesus has a claim to be the Son of God in the theological sense of the Creator, and I'm not saying where I'm at on that, it has to do with the fact that his teaching and life example was so much out of his time and place that he might as well have been doing things like writing EMC squared on a blackboard that wouldn't be understood for 10,000 years. We only barely have caught up with the idea that women are human beings. Jesus was treating women as full, emancipated human beings before anybody in any culture had thought about this. And so, when you look at this aspect, that's what salvation is. It's trying to follow in the footsteps of someone who planted an empathy time bomb in history, and to allow that to go off in your own heart and your own life. To me, that's the crux of the matter. So we'll have one more question, if there is one. Yeah.
As a past fundamentalist, I have a burning question. You mentioned falling on your knees and saying sorry to your daughter. Like I said, as a fundamentalist growing up that way, I remember having great ideology or great theology, as I thought, dogma, but horrible praxis. Just I didn't know how to treat people. Even I would say I'd had a lot of hate in my heart. Is that still something that haunts you? What is still that progression?
Yeah.
Out of that, you talk about a continual evolution.
Right.
I see myself continuing to evolve. What you said that you have a great relationship with your daughter now.
Yeah. By grace. I mean exactly what the gentleman here was saying. I don't ascribe that to me.
Do you still see yourself haunted by who you once were, or what does that look like now for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I'd say I see myself as on a journey, having not arrived anywhere in particular, but basically being able to see relationships with the people closest to me that are more what I'd want if I was in their shoes and less where they used to be. Where this kind of knee-jerk stuff haunts me is that, for instance, sometimes in my blogging that I do for Huffington Post, which I describe as cage fighting, All right? You know, if you read this here, you will come away with the idea that this guy is probably fairly nice. I mean, his grandchildren are in here and so forth and so on. If you read some of my political commentary, or you'll see me say on Rachel Maddow or one of these things, I change personality. And basically, people say to me, ooh, you're really good at this. And what they don't realize is I've changed the ideology, but the cage fighting part I understand from a different background. And I'm not sure that I would like to do that into the future. So, and it's a genuine question with me. It's not like I'm not sure, so I'm being wishy-washy. I'm genuinely sort of think this through. I mean, is this really, you know, if you're trying to follow Jesus and write books about your grandchildren, you know, do you really do cage fighting on the weekends as a way to support your writing the nice stuff in your books that you sort of mean, but this other stuff you just dash out because it's always, political commentary is always like an email. You hit send before you really, oh crap, I shouldn't, you know, I'm so sorry, Eric, I didn't mean what I just said, you know. So that's an area where I really find a sort of a knee-jerk reaction, or rather kind of a Pavlovian training. I hear the bell and go for it. And then sometimes I look back with some regret on things like that, and it's like, you know, what are you doing? And try to change it a little bit. Now, on the other hand, I'm trying to defend the cage fighter, so now we're getting into self-justification and bullshit, but I'll just go there. On the other hand, a lot of the people that I react against, I'm not actually defending myself at all. I am basically taking a whack at bullies who get away with what they're doing. And I'll give you an example of this that just enraged me and made me write things. I was at a community in Little Rock, Arkansas on this book tour a little while ago with a lovely community of people that came together with 2 gay ministers who take care of this parish. And if there's ever been a place where I felt the love of Jesus Christ, it was standing in that building. And what amazed me is, you know, you think of the gay activist movement, you sort of picture younger people most of the time, or you think of it that way. What amazed me is how much of the people they were ministering to were elderly gentlemen and women who had lived their whole life totally oppressed and destroyed in this ultra-conservative community. And I met one gentleman in his 80s who was weeping while he was telling me this story of having been prevented several years before from going to his own mother's funeral by his brother and his father, who were both ministers in the Southern Baptist denomination, who had said, you will defile her memory if a faggot like you comes in this door. Now that pisses me off. And so when I hear some Republican politician standing up, or some evangelical at one of these family values gatherings, bashing the right of this elderly gentleman to live in dignity with the partner he loves and share a life like I share with Jeannie, I put on my knuckle dusters and I strap on my shin guards. I jump into that cage and in a rage, and I will use every means at my disposal, rightly or wrongly, I'm just being honest, to fight back, because these are bullies. And those are the parts that I regret less. Because there's not, you still sort of wonder, you know, but I think that there's such a bullying aspect to this oppressiveness of taking religion and the heartfelt desire of people to have meaning and be reconciled to God, and then smashing them over the head with this moralistic construct, which no one lives up to. And yet you pick out this guy, you know, instead of some other thing. And also, just something more than you asked, this actually is something where I have not departed from where my dad was. Because in his life, gay people were always welcome in L'Abri. And one of his helpers and his secretary was a lesbian couple who lived down the hall from me. And Dad, this was way before any gay liberation movement, but Dad always treated people like human beings. And so, in that aspect of the kind of living witness of the gospel at its best, I grew up in a community which might have been fundamentalist in its theology, but not in the way my father treated human beings, whether it was gay people or race or anything like that. So, you know, that said, I must say, there's a tension in my life between the kind of blogging type writing I do sometimes, And what I'd really like in the best of all worlds, which would be just doing this and not having to kind of keep an interest in your work through that other stuff. And then I think the other place you feel it is just in human relationships. I mean, you sort of get a little further down the road and then something happens and you have a fight with Jeannie, or you react or yell at somebody or whatever, and you realize, hey man, all that illusion about having changed, I'm still back where I was. And that kind of self-righteousness wells out, and self-justification and so forth. So it's a long path. And I think, to be honest, anybody raised in that sort of religious environment has literal scars in your brain, a kind of a PTSD. It's not a psychological thing. It's genuine. Your brain's now wired differently. And you don't just get over it any more than people who've been in combat just snap out of it. Like, hey, just get yourself together, snap out of it. Well, your brain's actually, you have lesions now. So I think raised in that kind of context of a certain type of overbearing fundamentalist certainty actually damages our brains. Physically damages our brains. So it isn't just a question of adjusting your thoughts any more than a heroin addict can just say, okay, I'm not taking heroin anymore. Your brain is now wired to want that. So I will not run away. I'm going to go out and sign a few books, and if you want to ask other things, we'll stand out there and chat. And I think you were saying there was some food and things as well.
Yes.
And by the way, all kidding aside, I would like you to get the book, but if you can't afford the book, student or somebody else, or just a kleptomaniac, you can have one for free. So if you need the book, if you want the book and you can't afford it, I will give it to you over there, and I won't even loathe you when I do it. But if you want to buy it, go right ahead and buy it. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. What a treat. I failed to mention at the beginning the name of the series, of this year's speaker series, is Dwell With Me. And the invitation in that speaker series is to listen to each other's stories, and to the invitation to avoid the easy answers, to dwell with the topic, with the person. And I think we heard the invitation back to us today with Frank, which is, let's dwell on this earth together. And I really thank you for that invitation and such grace. We do have cookies out in the foyer. We also have, I call it frou-frou coffee. We have a barista here that is making fancy coffee and other coffee and water. Countryside knows how to do hospitality, and Eric is actually the best. And we do have books. I invite you to also don't forget your evaluation cards. There is a basket out there for evaluation cards as well. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.